Hello and welcome to this episode of Live with Lizzie Lee, powered by the China Project. I am your host, Lizzie. Joining me today is Professor Yun Zhou, Assistant Professor at University of Michigan's Department of Sociology. Thank you so much, Professor Zhou, for joining me today.
Thank you for having me.
So, Professor Zhou, help us understand the significance of China's population decline as we read so much in the news.
Thank you so much for the question. And yes, it has been in the news a lot. But in some ways, China's population decline has been a long time coming. And this is by no means a surprise. If we were to think of population size, immigration aside, really, we were thinking about birth and death. And China's birth rate has stayed below the replacement level since the early 1990s. And China's labor force over the past few years has also been declining. But what I also want to note is that in thinking about population, size certainly matters, but what really truly matters is population composition. Mm-hmm. So what the population is made up with regard to age and also with regard to sex. So in some ways, China's demographic crisis or the issue with China's population is also that the sex ratio is deeply imbalanced.
I see. Fantastic. So how is China's population crisis different from that of, say, Germany, South Korea, or Japan? Those are countries that we know are also facing the problem of an aging population.
Yeah, I'm really glad you are bringing this comparative perspective. And you're absolutely right that China is by no means the only country facing the declining birth. Japan's decline in fertility rate happened decades ago. Scholars generally find that birth declines with or alongside socioeconomic development. So birth declines as norms about marriage and childbearing changes. Birth declines alongside shifts in gender roles. So what are the desired or expected roles for women and men to fulfill? So the lesson for China is in some ways twofold. So on one hand, if we were to think about historically, China's one-child policy has treated China's large population as an issue. But if we were to think about population declines alongside socioeconomic development, then the question becomes, was the one-child policy a policy that created immense human suffering and restricted women's bodily autonomy? Was that really necessary? And on the other hand, in recent years, turning to countries like Germany, like Japan, and like South Korea, in both East Asian and Southern Europe, the finding is that if we were to think about people's transition to higher order birth, second birth, third birth, oftentimes scholars find that more equal division of labor at home, greater ability to reconcile the often incompatible work-family demands is often associated with greater likelihood or intention to transition into higher order birth. So for China, then now the lesson is, if we were to think about incentivizing birth as an objective or a desired objective in any way, then really gender equality or gender equity should not be left out of the discussion. Mm-hmm. Birth shouldn't be incentivized just as co-opting women's reproductive labor to meet some elusive demographic, political, economic goals.
Right. And when economists talk about China's population decline, they're also concerned about the potential economic or even political consequences. I wonder if you can help us understand those aspects a little bit more.
Yeah, so for China, over the last several decades, really, population has always been central to the state's political and economic objectives. Mm-hmm. So one-child policy was originally set up based on very pseudoscientific demographic projections. As China was coming out of the Cultural Revolution and the Chinese leadership at the time was grappling with regaining or reestablishing its political legitimacy, economic development was looked at the ways in which to achieve this goal, and reducing or limiting birth to one child per married heterosexual couple was viewed as this way in which population can be designed to achieve that goal. So in many ways, population has always been a deeply economic and political issue in China is as much a demographic issue as it's a political issue. And nowadays, not nowadays, with population aging and with a shrinking labor force, the issue becomes incentivizing birth for for political and economic targets.
Right. And in terms of government policy, now we have this trend of declining population. What do you expect the Chinese government will do in the future?
I will speak with respect to population policies. I'm sure there will be policy changes or policy considerations in terms of labor rights or in terms of rural governance. But so I will speak on population policies. So since 2016, China has universally relaxed the one-child policy with the 2016 universal two-child policy and the 2021 universal three-child policy. This is after the iterations that granted a partial relaxation of the one-child policy. But what we have been observing is that the two universal relaxations in 2016 and 2021 have not produced sustained growth in birth as desired by the Chinese leadership. So now the question becomes, what's next? And the question becomes, which is really an open question, it becomes, to what extent or to what extreme will the Chinese leadership go in terms of incentivizing birth? So incentivizing, what would the policy look like? Are births going to be incentivized through providing better infrastructure, through dealing with the pervasive labor market, gender inequality, and gender discriminations? Or are births going to be incentivized in similarly restrictive and harmful ways, just as it has been restricted historically? And I think that remains very much an open question to observe. And I do want to note anecdotally, and we do see some anecdotal evidence and journalistic reporting about attempts to limit, for example, vasectomy for unmarried young men. But in terms of scholarly evidence, it remains an open question. And I think it's something that we need to be attuned to.
Fantastic. As you mentioned, China's population problem is intertwined with its gender politics. What's your thinking on the implication on gender equity or gender equality, after this?
Yeah, thank you for this question. I think the link between decline of birth, the link between population dynamics is so closely linked to gender politics, and it's often a multifaceted and very much nuanced link. So in terms of China's population governance, throughout the one-child policy era and since its universal relaxations, what we have been observing is that women's bodies and women's reproductive labor in different ways are being utilized or co-opted as the ways in which to achieve the state's demographic, political, or economic goals. So so even with the relaxation to the one-child policy, it's still very much about co-opting women's reproductive labor rather than whether the concerns are not reproductive autonomy or women's or human rights in terms of reproduction. But on the other hand, the one-child policy and its universal relaxation also created different responses, even among Chinese women themselves, to the policies. So Chinese women are not a monolithic group with just it's not a monolithic group. So throughout the one-child policy era, we also see people or scholar writing about, for example, some women viewed the relaxation of viewed the one-child policy as relieving women from their reproductive burden, or that we have seen writings about highly educated urban singleton daughters view that one-child policy provided a chance in which they are no longer have to compete with male siblings for parental investment. But the question has always been, all these perceived more nuanced quote-unquote benefits is at whose cost and at what cost. But the general kind of answer to this question is gender equity and gender equality is such a fundamental aspect in trying to understand demographic issues, and we should not lose sight of that and just try to understand population size and composition as a pure issue of political and economic and social engineering.